Listen, there's a type of woman who will walk into your life like salvation itself, and she'll change everything you've spent decades building. And here's what nobody tells you: the warning signs are right there from day one. You're just not trained to see them because modern culture has deliberately obscured the patterns that matter most. The question isn't whether you'll encounter this type of woman. The question is, when you do, will you have the psychological clarity to walk away before it's too late? Because I've watched not hundreds, but thousands of competent, intelligent men turn their entire existence into a living negotiation with chaos, simply because they couldn't recognize these patterns early enough. What I'm about to share isn't about blaming women. It's about understanding the deep psychological architecture that determines whether a relationship will elevate you or systematically dismantle everything you value. This isn't theory. This is pattern recognition developed over decades of clinical observation. If you're watching this and something in your gut is already stirring, pay attention to that. Your unconscious mind may already know what your conscious awareness is refusing to acknowledge. By the end of this, you'll understand the 5 fundamental psychological patterns that distinguish between a partner who will build life with you and one who will turn your existence into a war zone. But more importantly, you'll learn why you're attracted to the very traits that will eventually harm you, and how to rewire that dangerous pattern. Let's start with something fundamental that most men completely misunderstand: the difference between genuine attraction and neurochemical addiction. When you meet a woman whose presence feels electrically charged, when conversations go until 3 in the morning and every moment apart feels like withdrawal, your brain is not experiencing love. It's experiencing the same neurochemical cascade that happens with substance dependence. The nucleus accumbens, the brain's reward center, floods with dopamine in response to unpredictability. And here's the crucial part: intermittent reinforcement creates stronger addiction than consistent reward. Think about that for a moment. Your brain becomes more attached to something that sometimes rewards you and sometimes doesn't, than to something that consistently treats you well. This is why slot machines work. This is why toxic relationships feel so compelling. The uncertainty itself becomes the drug. The woman who grew up in psychological chaos carries that chaos in her nervous system. She learned at a fundamental neurological level that love means turbulence, that peace means abandonment is approaching, that stability equals boredom. She doesn't consciously choose drama. Her autonomic nervous system literally cannot regulate in stable environments. When life becomes predictable, her body interprets that as danger, and she unconsciously creates crisis to return to what feels normal to her. You become addicted to being her salvation. Every time you fix a crisis she's created, your brain rewards you with a surge of meaning and purpose. But this is a trap. You're not building a relationship, you're becoming her external emotional regulation system. And when you inevitably fail to manage her internal chaos, you'll be blamed for the very instability she generates. Now, most men treat a woman's childhood stories like entertainment, fascinating narratives that explain her complexity. This is catastrophically naive. Her childhood isn't backstory. It's the source code that will determine every major conflict in your relationship. When she tells you about her absent father, her unstable mother, her string of failed relationships, she's giving you a diagnostic manual for your future together. The woman who grew up with conditional love will condition her love for you. The woman who experienced abandonment will create tests to see if you'll abandon her, and then interpret your staying as proof of weakness rather than devotion. Here's what breaks most men's hearts. When life gets genuinely good, stable job, healthy routines, mutual respect, her nervous system interprets this as the calm before abandonment. So she sabotages it, not consciously. But her wounded inner child, frozen at the age of her deepest trauma, will drive the relationship forward in ways that recreate familiar pain, because pain at least feels predictable. And this is perhaps the hardest truth. Your devotion cannot rewire her neural architecture. Trauma bonding isn't healed by more bonding. It's healed by intensive therapeutic work that most people never undertake because it requires confronting the most painful parts of their psychological history. Your role isn't to be her therapist. You're not qualified for that job, and she didn't hire you for it. The Stoics understood something modern psychology is only now confirming. You cannot control another person's internal reality, only your response to it. You can control whether you clearly communicate your boundaries. You cannot control whether she respects them. You can control your decision to walk away from chaos. You cannot control her decision to create it. This distinction isn't pessimistic. It's liberating. It frees you from the exhausting delusion that enough patience, enough love, enough accommodation will fundamentally change someone who hasn't committed to changing themselves. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." Applied here, waste no more time wishing she were different. Act according to the reality of who she is, not the potential of who you imagine she could become. This isn't giving up on her. It's refusing to abandon yourself. Now let's talk about boundaries, because here's where modern discourse has created catastrophic confusion. There's a profound difference between healthy boundary setting and emotional terrorism. A healthy boundary sounds like, "I need time to process this conversation. Let's revisit it tomorrow when we're both calmer." It's a request that creates safety for both people. A toxic boundary sounds like, "I don't tolerate disrespect, so I'm not speaking to you for a week." It's punishment disguised as self-care, designed to train you into submission through withdrawal of affection. She'll frame every reasonable request you make, "Could we discuss this more calmly?" as an attack on her authentic self-expression. This is manipulation masquerading as empowerment. Authentic expression that systematically damages another person isn't authentic. It's unprocessed trauma being dumped onto your nervous system, and you're being manipulated into accepting it as your duty. Over time, you'll find yourself accepting treatment that violates every principle of human dignity, because she's reframed your request for basic respect as evidence of your inadequacy. Your need for sleep becomes lack of commitment. Your desire for personal time becomes proof you don't love her enough. Your body keeps the score even when your mind is too confused to recognize the pattern. This is perhaps the most dangerous asymmetry. She demands absolute respect for her boundaries while treating yours as personal attacks. She requires access to your phone, your passwords, your schedule, your thoughts, claiming that transparency equals trust. Meanwhile, her privacy is sacred, her alone time non-negotiable, her mysterious mood swings beyond question. This isn't partnership, it's psychological colonization. She's establishing that your internal world is subject to her inspection while hers remains sovereign territory. Every boundary you attempt to set activates her deepest fear, abandonment. But instead of recognizing this as her issue to process, she makes it your problem to solve. Your perfectly reasonable request, "I need 30 minutes to decompress after work before we discuss serious topics," gets interpreted through her trauma lens as, "You're pulling away, you're going to leave." And she'll escalate to prevent that imagined abandonment, ironically pushing you toward the very exit she fears. Gradually, imperceptibly, you find yourself living in a psychological prison where her emotional state determines the rules of reality. You walk on eggshells, constantly monitoring her mood, preemptively managing her reactions, editing your authentic responses to avoid triggering her next crisis. This is how strong men become shadows of themselves, not through dramatic defeat, but through the daily erosion of their right to exist as separate individuals. Epictetus taught, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Applied to relationships, if you want to maintain your psychological integrity, be content with being called controlling, unloving, or not man enough. Your boundaries aren't negotiable based on her emotional state. They're not flexible during her good moods and strict during her bad ones. They exist because you are a separate human being with sovereign rights over your own life. When she tests them, and she will, your job isn't to justify them. It's to maintain them. She'll escalate to get a reaction. Tears, rage, threats, accusations, all designed to make you abandon your position and rush to emotional rescue. The response isn't cold indifference, it's warm steadiness. "I understand you're upset. My boundary remains unchanged. I'm available to discuss this when you're ready to do so respectfully." And ultimately, you must accept this truth. Some relationships cannot be saved, and attempting to save them will cost you everything else. your mental health, your physical vitality, your financial stability, your relationship with your children. These are not acceptable sacrifices to prove your devotion to someone who treats your devotion with contempt. Now, marriage is supposed to be the ultimate collaborative endeavor. Two people amplifying each other's strengths, compensating for each other's weaknesses, celebrating combined victories. The toxic woman transforms this into a zero-sum competition where your success diminishes her. You get promoted. Instead of celebration, you face crisis. Suddenly, there's a fight about something unrelated, an emergency that requires your immediate attention or emotional distance that punishes you for directing energy toward your career. This isn't coincidence. Her unconscious mind perceives your success as a threat to her position, her control, her relevance. If you're succeeding, you might realize you don't need her, or worse, that you could do better. You share your concerns about the relationship, attempting connection through honesty. She catalogs every vulnerability you reveal and uses it against you during future conflicts. You mentioned feeling insecure about your body. She'll make comments about attractive men at the gym. You shared childhood pain about your father's criticism. She'll mirror that criticism during arguments. This is why good men eventually stop sharing. They've learned that openness is reconnaissance. Your friendships threaten her because they represent emotional resources flowing away from her. Your hobbies infuriate her because they create spaces where you're content without her presence. Your family relationships become targets because they remind you of what healthy connection feels like. She doesn't consciously articulate this competition, but her behavior consistently works to isolate you, to make her the sole source of emotional significance in your life, to ensure you need her more than she needs you. This is perhaps the most insidious psychological move. She reframes every attempt at healthy relationship dynamics as evidence of your inadequacy. You ask her to communicate more kindly, using language from every relationship book ever written. She responds that you're trying to suppress her authentic expression, control her emotions, silence her truth. Your reasonable request, the foundation of any functional partnership, gets reinterpreted as tyranny. And suddenly, you're defending yourself against charges of being controlling when all you asked for was basic respect. You express a need for more physical affection, emotional presence, or quality time. Instead of hearing this as information about maintaining connection, she hears it as evidence of your neediness, your inadequacy, your failure to be self-sufficient. The cruel irony: she demands constant emotional attention while simultaneously shaming you for having parallel needs. Every attempt to hold her accountable for harmful behavior gets reframed as manipulation. You're hurt by what I said? Well, you're just manipulating me with your emotions. The psychological move is brilliant in its cruelty. She's made it impossible to name the problem without becoming the problem. This is how men end up apologizing for their own mistreatment. Seneca wrote, "No man is crushed by fortune unless he is first deceived by her." The deception here is believing you can win a competition you never agreed to enter. The first step is recognizing that you're in a competitive dynamic where partnership should exist. When every conversation feels like a debate to win, when every conflict has a victor and a defeated party, when keeping score has replaced keeping connection, you're not in a marriage, you're in psychological combat. The response isn't trying harder to win her approval or proving your worth through better performance. It's recognizing that the game itself is corrupt and refusing to continue playing. This doesn't mean fighting back with her tactics. It means calmly, firmly establishing that you will not participate in turning connection into competition. Accept that she may never see you as a partner rather than a rival. Accept that her childhood programming may be too deeply embedded to change without years of intensive work she's unlikely to undertake. Accept that your worthiness isn't determined by her validation. This acceptance isn't defeat. It's the foundation of making clear-eyed decisions about your future. So let me bring this full circle. I started by saying the warning signs are always there from the beginning, and now you understand what to look for. The woman who manufactures drama isn't passionate, she's traumatized. The woman who violates your boundaries isn't strong, she's terrified. The woman who competes with you isn't independent, she's incapable of partnership. But here's what matters most. Recognizing these patterns doesn't make you cynical. It makes you discerning. It protects you from mistaking intensity for connection, chaos for chemistry, and dependency for devotion. The path forward requires 3 commitments. First, develop the psychological clarity to recognize these patterns before you're emotionally invested. Learn to distinguish between a woman who challenges you to grow and one who challenges your sanity. The former asks you to become better. The latter demands you become smaller. Second, understand that you cannot love someone into health. Your devotion will not heal her childhood trauma. Your consistency will not rewire her neural pathways. Your patience will not transform her psychological architecture. The only person you can change is yourself, and sometimes that change means having the courage to walk away from someone you love but cannot live with. Third, build your own psychological foundation so strongly that no relationship can shake it. Your worth isn't determined by her validation. Your reality isn't subject to her revision. Your boundaries aren't negotiable based on her emotional state. When you're grounded in your own sovereignty, you become immune to manipulation masquerading as connection. And here's the truth that modern culture desperately tries to obscure. Choosing peace over passion, stability over intensity, and psychological health over familiar chaos isn't settling. It's finally choosing life over slow-motion harm. The Stoics understood something we've forgotten. Not every battle is worth fighting, not every person is worth saving at the cost of yourself, and not every beginning needs to reach its natural end. Sometimes the most courageous act is recognizing incompatibility early enough to prevent catastrophe. If you're in a relationship that matches these patterns, you face a binary choice. Accept that this is your life until circumstances change dramatically, or develop a strategy that protects your sanity, your finances, your children, and your future. There is no middle ground with profound psychological toxicity. Love isn't enough when the relationship's operating system is fundamentally broken. And if you're not yet in this situation, congratulations. You now have the pattern recognition to avoid it. Use this knowledge not to become bitter toward women, but to become more discerning about partnership. There are women who will meet your strength with their own, who will build life with you rather than tear it apart, who will treat your vulnerabilities as sacred rather than strategic, but you'll only attract them when you've developed the self-respect to walk away from those who don't. Pay attention to how she treats service workers, how she talks about former friends, how she handles minor frustrations. The woman who explodes at baristas over wrong coffee orders will eventually explode at you over much smaller infractions. Notice her relationship with boundaries, both setting them and respecting yours. Does she communicate needs clearly or create elaborate tests to see if you can read her mind? Does she respect your time, space, and autonomy? Or does she treat your boundaries as personal attacks? Watch how she handles conflict in the early stages. Does she seek resolution and understanding, or does she seek to win at all costs? Does she take responsibility for her role in problems, or does she always find ways to make everything someone else's fault? If you recognize these patterns in your current relationship, understand that love cannot fix psychological damage this profound. The only chance for change requires her to acknowledge the damage, commit to intensive therapy, and do years of difficult internal work to rebuild her psychological foundation. This rarely happens because the toxic woman's operating system interprets any suggestion of personal growth as evidence that you don't accept her authentic self. The path to freedom requires rebuilding your own psychological foundation, reconnecting with your authentic preferences and boundaries, and learning to recognize healthy relationship dynamics. It means accepting that the intense connection you thought was love was actually sophisticated psychological manipulation. Most importantly, it means understanding that choosing peace over passion, stability over intensity, and health over familiarity isn't settling. It's finally choosing life. Never marry a woman whose childhood trauma has become your relationship's operating system. Never marry a woman who mistakes chaos for connection, competition for partnership, or emotional terrorism for authentic expression. Never marry a woman who sees your boundaries as barriers to overcome rather than instructions for loving you well. Your future self, your children, and your financial security will thank you for having the courage to recognize these patterns before they become the permanent architecture of your life. This is PsycheLens, and this work, understanding the deep psychology that determines whether relationships elevate or harm us, this is what we do here. If this resonated, if something in your gut confirmed what your mind was afraid to acknowledge, subscribe to this channel. Because we're going deeper into the psychological patterns that matter most, the ones that determine whether you'll spend your life building or constantly rebuilding from rubble. The warning signs are always there. The question is, do you have eyes to see them? Choose wisely. The consequences echo through generations.